Okay, we are live. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to the people. With me today via phone, we have Lindsey Boylan. Lindsey, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lindsey, I really wanted to chat to you today about getting to know more about yourself as well as your campaign and what you're doing in New York's 10th district. But before we get into, frankly, what you're fighting for within your campaign, I'd love to get to know you a little bit better. Could you let us know what you were doing before you ran for office and potentially are still doing while running for office, whether that be employment or other activities that you're involved in?
Sure. So the last official job I had before running for office, I worked for the state of New York. I was the Deputy Secretary for Economic Development, and that's a really long-winded way of saying I was the jobs person for the state of New York.
Yeah.
And I also oversaw the housing portfolio and a few other big agencies and the like for the state. And it was the last job in my 4 years of working for the state. And I left about, over a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now, as I've been running for 14 months. So it's been a long time, full-time job. Aside from running, there isn't that much going on, aside from the fact that I have a 6-year-old daughter, and she's the light of my life. And she just graduated kindergarten online, which is a strange byproduct of our current moment. But I'm very proud of her, and my husband and I work really hard to be good parents. So that's probably the main focus of my time, aside from this Herculean effort to challenge the system and win this congressional seat.
Yeah, and I bet you could probably even admit, despite having that full-time job, raising kids can be a job that can be significantly more difficult potentially. Regardless of how lovely the kid is, we can acknowledge that work is something being truly undervalued right now. One thing I wanted to know is, you were doing this job beforehand, serving for New York State, helping with job development. What led you to be inspired 14 months ago to be able to leave that and run for this office in New York's 10th district?
Well, my whole career has kind of been, how do I problem solve? How do I make something better? And how do I grow from that experience? And it started in urban planning because I thought we could make cities better. Then I went into municipal finance because I wanted to understand how you funded infrastructure and government. And then I went and worked for the state when I actually wanted to, be firsthand engaged with trying to make a better state, a better system. And I learned a lot. I mean, I was there for 4 years, helped get the $15 minimum wage, helped pass paid leave, helped create thousands upon thousands of jobs all over the state. And ultimately, it was a tremendous learning experience and also a very toxic environment. And I think for me, our politics and how we create government and what that looks like and who serves in it and for whom it works is a reflection of, our values. And I ended up finding myself, the only mom of young kids on senior staff for the governor. And I was really burnt out. And I had seen all of these women, especially moms, get out in the midterms and, say that demand better for their communities and for their families. And I was so inspired by that. And, I at the same time, my daughter was in pre-K and I was supposed to work with her on her propensity to take chances and tell her to do more of it. And, if I've got to put my cards on the table, if I felt like I can do better, a lot better than our current leadership in helping our community, especially through a painful time like we have right now, I've got to be willing to put myself out there. And I'm so glad I did, because now more than ever, I think we need a whole new generation of leaders, much more diverse group of leaders to get into the arena and run and win and see the changes that we need.
Yeah, I think that certainly makes a lot of sense. I wanted to hear more clarity around what you think that misalignment of representation that the current representative, Jerry Nadler, is bringing to the to the district. What issues is he not addressing that you want your constituents to have finally handled?
Well, I mean, when it's taking you 30 years or 3 decades to pass 3 pieces of legislation, one of those being naming a building after the guy who died in office to get the seat, so he could get the seat.
Yeah.
2 of the 3 things that took him 3 decades to pass are ceremonial. Meanwhile, we have the most unequal district in the country. We have a district that's entirely coastline. Thus, we should be leading on climate change related policy. There is no leadership. It's all following. It's all a game of follow the leader. It's all a game of projections, strongly worded letters, acting as if he's going to be our savior from Donald Trump, which, wow, years in does not seem at all the case, because it isn't. And, he's someone who professes to have progressive values, but I'm really not sure how progressive you can be when your community is in such pain and has so many challenges, particularly being the heart of such inequality. When we have thousands of people living in NY-10, New York City's public housing, in inhumane conditions, when we have extreme issues around housing like homelessness and mental health crises that are affecting every community, but especially ours. I mean, more people in Manhattan are Googling before this crisis depression, anxiety, and therapy than gun control, climate change, and plumber combined.
Yeah.
And I just looked at this guy who's been there for 30 years, and I really got to wondering, how come it's so easy to talk about doing things and talk about legislation that never actually becomes law? And I think that that's not progressive at all. And then there are issues that, beyond not moving on the greatest issues of our day, beyond not leaving on them, there are a number of issues that I think are going to become more and more important, particularly related to technology and the boundaries of privacy and the boundaries of monopoly that there's just no way he's going to be able to do. One, because he takes corporate money directly from all those, his biggest contributors, directly from corporations. Corporate PAC money this year were Google and Facebook. And he's supposed to be leading the charge on antitrust legislation. He's supposed to be, protecting his community's privacy and consumers' rights and small businesses' rights. It's just not going to happen. And that's why it hasn't happened. And, we've been overdue for antitrust legislation, or at least antitrust hearings around the tech industry for a long time, including, Amazon and some of the late breaking information of how they do anti-competitive tactics to destroy small businesses that sell on their platform, including many small businesses in my community. And so he doesn't get it. He takes a lot of money from these tech companies. And then where our privacy is concerned with respect to technology, he's on the wrong side of history, in my view. At this time where we're having record global protest, he is one of the lead quarterbacks for FISA renewal in the House. And I'm a product of, I was in senior in high school when 9/11 happened. And I had lobbied Capitol Hill at that time to protect our civil liberties. And we know here in New York how the broad stretch and interpretation of law enforcement's access to potential quote unquote counterterrorism and law enforcement uses can get really used against people. Occupy Wall Street, the data, people's mobile phones were telling law enforcement things that they have no right to access, especially without a warrant. And how can you even think about advocating for renewal at a moment where our own government is clearly acting out against our own protesters that have the right to protest, the right to free speech, and are doing it on such a compelling basis? And so I do think he's really on the wrong side of history on what will be one of the biggest areas of questions, one of the biggest issues we have to contend with in the next several decades.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. There's several issues there that you really highlighted as being just frankly future forward looking issues that Jerry is just not going to be ready to handle. I'm curious if you are able to be elected. You touched on the ideas of education, of climate change, of technology. general economic inequality. What do you think are some of those first few, let's say 3 proposals that you want to try and push forward across the finish line if you are elected to the House?
Well, I mean, first I would say I'd really like to get on the Appropriations Committee because I think there's going to be a lot of action there, particularly with respect to law enforcement, with respect to everything. And, that's usually one of the first questions I get asked is what would you want to serve on? And that's, sort of part and parcel connected to whatever's going to be going on that's the committee I'd like to serve on. And of course, I will be a freshman member of Congress, but I don't think, I'm going to push for what I want and find ways to get there. I really would like to see. I will be leading on mental health legislation. I'm a wholehearted supporter of Medicare for all. I think we will get there. Especially this moment has, I think, proven how dangerous it is to have a country's healthcare system not keep us healthy. And in my view, we already are paying for a Medicare for all system. We're just not getting it for the price tag because of the amount of philanthropy, naming rights, accepting people in hospitals after they've come to a place of emergency as opposed to preventative health and the like. So I'm a full proponent of Medicare for all. The specific piece that I think I can bring to the table in terms of legislation is related to mental health care and true parity in a Medicare for all system, because I don't try to other issues of mental health. I grew up in a family where multiple generations of women lost custody of their kids because of mental illness and addiction, and I was part of that that generation to break the mold. I'm a great mom, and I also have a lot of resources to support me being a great mom. It's in my view, in many ways, a privilege to get to be a quote unquote good mom, and it's not something you do alone. And I don't think we resource nearly enough families and support for therapy, where appropriate, pharmaceuticals, more research. I want a moonshot idea in mental health. I want mental health Medicare for all. And there is going to be no more compelling time to do it than post a moment where every single person in this country has experienced trauma. Yeah. And at this point, we have a patchwork system that really works for very few people. And the people who it works for are very wealthy or have the means to make choices. I mean, I spent my 20s and I had healthcare tied to my employer in my 20s in New York. But I had no money. My rent was a lot. I moved 9 times in 10 years. I was never on my, never on the, lease. And I had to choose between dental work and going to the dentist and seeing my therapist. And I chose the therapist because I knew the kind of environment that I came from, the, generations of trauma, the things I experienced that I take with me. So I knew that was a given, but I shouldn't have to choose between seeing a dentist or, that kind of stuff. It's just a completely ridiculous system. And so I'm going to lead on that. I'm also going to lead on privacy issues and really countering the power, I think, of the tech companies, not because I don't see the importance of them. I mean, I use pretty much all of the tech platforms. But it's going to take, in my view, people from our generation to really lead on that front. And, just anecdotally, someone on the congressman's staff marked my entire staff as dead in the main,
I saw that.
main political platform. And my question to them was, their staff, which they haven't answered, is this is either extremely nefarious or extremely stupid. And I haven't gotten an answer, but I was like, which one is it? And I'm not sure, but either way, it's probably a combination of both. But just the fact that you could not even realize that you have to hide your tracks for something like that, aside from the ethics of it, indicates to me that his team just doesn't even understand the kinds of questions around use, acceptable use, privacy, all of the intricacies that we really need to understand in order to advocate for New Yorkers and for Americans within the context of tech firms and the like. How can he possibly do that if his staff doesn't even know how to do Oppo work? I mean, forget ethics, but it's just kind of ridiculous. So mental health, privacy related, and Housing as well, because, and I'd say climate change, but housing especially, because as soon as all of these emergency interventions in terms of increased unemployment and checks that have been sent to people and small business assistance dries up, we're going to have an immediate issue, especially in New York, where we were the center of the pandemic, where people won't be able to make rent.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I realize I don't take office until 2021, but we're going to have systemic issues around housing and then jobs that we're going to have to deal with. And there are a lot of things I want to do, but that's really top on my mind right now.
Yeah, I think these 2 points of clarification I'd love to hear. The first is, of the top two issues that you gave, mental health as well as technology around the privacy space specifically. I think those are really big issues. I wanted to know what you think can be done in that kind of interrelated relationship of how technology is driving a lot of our mental health issues. I know for a fact a lot of our kids, you have a kid of your own, not yet at that social media era age. I think you had said they're 6, but they are, when they get to that preteen and near teenage, that is one of the leading causes of death and frankly just unhappiness for a lot of the younger generation is their frequent usage of social media. In the past, we had an environment where bullying took place in the school and that's it. But now bullying is being taken home with us a lot of the time.
Yeah.
What do you think is something that can be done within the technology space to foster better, mental health that the government can get involved in?
Well, I do think to a certain extent, it's still early days. It feels in some sense like the wild. One of the challenges of the very real issue you brought up is that we haven't invested nearly enough research money in mental health. So one of the things I'm advocating for is a lot more research in the National Institutes of Mental Health and integrated systems thinking about what leads to the many causes and the many impacts around mental health. So that's an under-researched, under-invested in area, which is exploding now in the private sector, but we need to do a lot more. And then we're still, in my view, in the scheme of things, in pretty early days in terms of how our platforms are set up to work with people. And I got to tell you, being on Twitter, I understand I'm running for office, but if someone came up to me on the street. Can I swear on the show?
Yeah, you may. Go right ahead.
If someone came up on the street and was standing in front of my face and kept calling me a shithead and then kept walking with me, that would be over. We would stop having the conversation. I would move away. But somehow on Twitter, you're supposed to suck it up, and I don't to me, we're looking 5 years down the line. That is not going to be the reality. There are going to be, rules of the road. There are going to be changes to interactions. And I'm not talking about getting people's freedom of speech, but you would absolutely not get to stand in front of my face and, say derogatory things or your face on the street. But that's what we do online. Not everyone, but that's what happens online. And there are really no boundaries to it, especially because you can basically be anonymous and do that. So there's really no accountability. And I think that's going to have to change. And I think that is really connected to what you're talking about with bullying in our kids, because the cyberbullying is all about a picture appears of a 12-year-old doing something and immediately 2 counties away, all the teenagers know about it. And it's so hard to track accountability with that. I think where the government is best suited is to ensure basic standards of people's individual human rights and the like. Now, I am not a lawyer in this realm. I want to be engaged in these conversations because it's not cut and dry, right? You don't want to create a police state where people can't say what they want to, and we have to always protect that. But should you be able to put someone's personal address on a public forum and say, go get her, Lindsey Boylan lives here and she wants to.
I mean, that's already illegal. Doxing is a crime currently, but I do generally agree with you that these are things that are kind of does feel like that Wild West vibe that you described and has been severely under researched. I think one of the things that needs to be had is also we have a public square frankly, everyone can participate there. What are like the reasonable bounds that can be imposed? And I think we're still starting to discover some of those. But I do think the idea of just like some level of data ownership rights so that some information can't be disseminated like doxing, like you're saying, is really important because they can get their hands on it way too easily right now because the data is just not secured.
Right. And the other thing I would say about that is it's not always the fact that a lot of this stuff gets removed, right? But you just mentioned kids. It's not that it's that it was ever up because these terrible instances of cyberbullying, it's not that the image is up there forever. It's that it appeared and immediately everyone knew about it. And so, I don't think it's ever a good idea. I never think people who profess to have all the answers to these things are very good leaders or managers, but I do absolutely know that we're going to need to spend a lot of time on that because it's just early days. And obviously these different platforms are taking different strategies. Twitter, has foregone all political advertising, whereas Facebook, it's like anything goes. I'll go on there on my page and it'll be like, burn in hell, bitch, all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, it's kind of funny, but you're also kind of like, well, if this is happening to me, what's going to happen to my 6-year-old when she gets online? Right. So, and again, we always have to be vigilant in protecting our First Amendment rights. And I'm not saying that needs to be reduced. Every problem that we have that is worth solving in our democracy is very complicated, but we do not have people at the table who are really cognizant of all of the complications, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I wanted to get to the second clarification I wanted to have on the 3 issues you had. You mentioned housing, and specifically, it's totally an understandable issue to be bringing up right now, both on a renter side as well as the mortgage side. A lot of people are unable to just pay those basic bills. And yes, we've had these suspensions of payments, but it's not like they put them to the back end. It's just they gave it a 3-month delay and then you have to pay back everything that was previously missing. So, I wanted to ask what you think are the solutions right now that people should be pursuing to help in this crisis around housing. And then furthermore, what you hope to do if you were to be elected come 2021 that you'd want to do in terms of housing on a federal level.
Sure. So my first goal in this broader crisis, the public health crisis, and I'd love to have a more in-depth conversation too about the protests and about systemic racism and what we need to do there because it's really important. But right now I'm just talking about kind of the stage setting before our current reality now, which was the public health crisis alone. And I was an advocate for giving people $2,000 checks monthly, not means tested, so everyone.
Yep.
And a big part of why I was supportive of that is because there are so many complexities within our employment system and our housing market and our commercial rental market that I would rather give people more money so that they can do the things that they need to do than assume that $1,200 checks to people making $75,000 or less, plus unemployment benefits, once you get through the bottleneck, are going to be enough.
Yeah.
And my first goal, and unfortunately, I don't think we're any longer at that place, probably, would have been to give people enough cash to do the essentials that they need to do and make those decisions for themselves. But because that didn't happen largely, and because small businesses weren't assisted with grants and instead loans that have a lot of red tape associated with them, it means that people don't even have this temporary money to pay their rent. And so that's why the rent relief movement is so important. And I am for absolute rent relief programs that would allow people to apply with some proof and get their rent covered. Now, just ending rent and not having the state cover the delta between that and backed up by the federal government is a problem for me in stuff I'm hearing in my community, because there are a lot of people whose income is based off of, let's say, owning an apartment that they don't live in. So it's just to say it's more complicated than that, which is why my preference would have been giving everyone checks so that they can be adults like we all hope we can be, temporary UBI, and do it that way. Unfortunately, I don't think we have leaders that are capable of getting there. So it ends up being that we're going to spend a lot more time, money, and complication, and more people are going to be hurt because we'll take a blunt force object to fixing the problem after the fact when people are already losing their apartments. And of course, you mentioned the difference between mortgages and rents. And my observation is that is always the unfortunate reality. I think I mentioned to you, I oversaw the state's recovery work in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And part of my job was to oversee the 30-person SWAT team, so to speak, to help them make their federal aid request for damages. And in every case, with FEMA, with emergency funds from HUD, it's always homeowners that get bailed out or assisted first, and it's always people who are renting who have a harder time getting the support they need, and that just reinforces whether we're talking about a climate-related crisis like Hurricane Maria or a public health crisis like Corona, that the people who are hurt the most are the ones who need the help the most. And it just doesn't work. So, in my view, and I've talked about this a lot within the context of climate disasters and preparedness for those, in addition to, being supportive broadly of a Green New Deal, we need to completely revamp our emergency, our HUD and our workforce dedicated in FEMA to how we assist and our National Guard, how we assist localities in crisis, and how we support them financially. And that's another reason why I want to serve on appropriations, because what I saw when I was, and this does relate to your question, I promise, what I saw when I was overseeing the recovery work in Puerto Rico was that we were trying to help the Puerto Rican government put together their federal aid request, and it was like a game of Wheel of Fortune, as terrible and macabre as it sounds, because it is. We were competing against forest fires in California, Texas flooding, and 9/11 victim compensation fund for the same pot of money from the same group of staid politicians who have little context and awareness, are entirely politicized. And part of the reason why New York was engaged with that was because Puerto Rico doesn't have congressional representatives with voting power, and New York is very accustomed to dealing with storm-related crises because we had Hurricane Sandy, and we have NYPA and energy groups that are able to assist and provide mutual aid. But what I learned was our federal government is totally screwed in terms of how it deals with crises like this and like a public health crisis. And so I'm really passionate about helping to fix that and make it easier for people to get help, because when we don't, it means that a lot of mistakes are made. And when mistakes are made in a public health crisis or a climate-related disaster, people die. Thousands more people in Puerto Rico. There was a Carnegie Mellon research study that said thousands more people died than needed to because of government's inability to act quickly. Does that sound like anything else, like New York?
Yeah.
It's these stories are slightly different, but we keep replaying the same story until we get people into office who don't only deal in policy broadly with, taglines, but understand the nuance of implementation. Because if you don't, it's kind of like why I have such distaste for Nancy Pelosi, because, her famous quote about the Affordable Care Act was, we'll figure out what it is when it's out there in the law, and that, unfortunately, I think is a lot of what happens on Capitol Hill and in Congress. Yep. And it means that people are suffering. And I'm a real passionate about operational side of policy as well, and what it means, how it can save people, how it can put people in further pain. And, on the short-term issues around housing and around appropriations, especially, I think there's a lot more we could do with emergency response and how we find ways to not disadvantage and handicap, basically, our renters and people who need more assistance, because it's always them who are suffering the most.
Yeah, no, I really agree with a lot of the points you there. I think the biggest point that you kind of touched on is how unprepared we are for crises in general. And it's frankly, we're not going to be having these slow up anytime soon. You know, we're getting through this, but we have, as you mentioned beforehand, we have the climate crisis on the horizon and many people who are going to be displaced from that, and how that's going to have a severe impact on housing as well, with so many people who are by these coastal areas needing to find new housing because they're going to have to move away for their own safety's sake. So I think that is a really big thing. And you're right. I have a mutual disdain for Nancy Pelosi, because not only is it just working on the fly, but it's blocking people who have thought out a lot of these solutions from trying to even adapt. Like when we had this past cycle, her trying to propose like pay-go rules as a major package from the Democratic rule side, that just limits our ability to have flexibility to adapt on the fly. Because these crises do happen, and you're not always going to be able to line up the tax side with the spending side the whole time. Sometimes you're going to need to get that side back because you need to act quickly on servicing the crisis in general. So I do agree with you there.
I think that what you just mentioned, in my view, is a great example of how the Democratic leadership have really given up the moral high ground to the Republicans, just in an effort to appease special interest groups and to keep the support of corporate donors. I really, I never thought I would be like saying that out loud, because I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I've been a good soldier for a long time. I worked for Andrew Cuomo, who's not exactly progressive, and I went to Wellesley because I was inspired by Hillary Clinton, and but I think, like a lot of my generation, I'm assuming you're younger than everyone now is younger than I am, but a lot of my generation, I think what is happening right now is a real reflection of the idea that the idea of the American dream does not really exist. And for some people, especially if you're Black in America, it never existed. And it's even more clear that instead of getting closer to parity on issues of race and on issues of economic background, we're getting further away. And it's just not going to cut it to have people like Nancy Pelosi just say, well, we'll play along. We'll just, we don't want anything. We don't want to scare corporate interests by growing our deficit. That would be so scary. Well, let me tell you, what would be really scary is to have a Great Depression that could have been less worse, because we could have actually given people the money to tie them over during shelter in place, instead of doing some ridiculous half measure that didn't help anyone shelter in place, and all the while not figuring out contact tracing and testing that actually would leave us better prepared after shelter in place.
Yeah, I really do agree with you there. It's been, I've seen this kind of one meme circling around the internet of kind of that relationship. It uses this George Floyd case as a prime example. They basically paint Derek Chauvin as if it's the Republican Party actively harming the people. But then you have the cops that were standing right by him and not actually doing anything to address the problem.
Yes.
So I think that's really become a large relationship, why so many people from the younger generation who have had increased information access because we've grown up in this internet age, really be able to have just a distaste for both parties. But, I wanted to now turn to more of like the political strategy side, because, I think these are good ideas that you're advocating for. So I wanted to hear how we can actually implement them if you're getting into office, because as you acknowledged beforehand, obviously there's other factors, but Jerry Nadler did not do much in his 30 years in office. No. I wanted to know how you think you can accomplish doing things in office that frankly can be a little bit hard, in that not all the moderate Democrats are necessarily on our side yet with Medicare for all, and we actively have the Republicans opposing it. What is your strategy if you get into office to try and advance these causes?
Yeah, well, I think for too long, as I said, I think we've been playing nice and assuming that will be reflected in how the Republicans act. But Mitch McConnell doesn't want to be our friend. No. He wants to destroy us. And I will never, I'll never forget that. I think that there's actually there are a lot more people who have a lot of common goals in hand than is represented by the leadership of our party and the leadership of the Republicans. I think that there will absolutely be an avenue to transforming our healthcare system, and for me especially our mental health care system, after we've seen how much better other countries have dealt with this crisis, not just because everyone has healthcare, but everyone has things like paid leave, and everyone has things like, you know, just a supply chain to provide for a whole country. I mean, part of the reason why we had such a challenge is because we don't even have a supply chain that's set up to actually care for our people. How fucked up is that? I mean,
oh my God.
I think,
Yeah.
sorry, did I not say F-bomb?
No. I'm more reacting to the whole injustice and stupidity of the supply chain,
Yeah.
not the cursing.
Yeah.
I care less about that fucking thing.
It's just like, it's so unbelievable. So I really, you know, one of the things keeps being, and I don't want to keep going back to the police brutality and systemic racism, but I keep seeing this chart on Twitter that's like, isn't it great? Isn't it unbelievable that we now have mass agreement in this country that police brutality is a thing? Oh my gosh, like this never happens. Well, and my response is, well, it never happens until it does. So, you know, like who could ever, if someone had told me I would be running for Congress and I would be sitting in my apartment for 3 months, and my daughter would be going to kindergarten online, and that, you know, anything that has happened in the last few weeks would be the reality, I would have said, no way. Are you kidding me? No way. What are you talking about? I don't want us to suffer from this idea that because things have been one way, that they're always going to be that way. And I really, you know, I'm a realist. I worked for someone who is heavy on realism and light on inspiration. And so I've seen how that political side works. So it's not like I'm naive, but I really do believe that people will come out of this. And if we have the right kind of leaders who are energetic and passionate and showing up in our communities, and we have a new team, not the current team, leading the charge, we will get a lot further. I really believe that, especially on, you know, one of my marquee issues, which is mental health. I'll just give you an example of sometimes the world isn't exactly what it seems to be. In New York City, you would assume that several members of the city's congressional delegation would be members of the mental health caucus, right? Because like anywhere else, but especially New York, this is a pressure cooker city. This is a challenging city. This is an anxiety-inducing environment. Not a single member in the city is a member of the mental health caucus. The one person in the entire state that is a member of the mental health caucus is Catco, a Republican from upstate. Now, I'm not saying like we're all family and we're going to be best friends all the time. Don't get me wrong. The fact that a conservative Republican is a member of the mental health caucus, I was like, let me learn more. What's going on here? And apparently he had, I think, a niece or a goddaughter who committed suicide, and it really affected him. And, you know, I'll give a speech, and my aunt committed suicide in her house, and I was the last one to see her, and I've told you a little bit about my family. So I'll give a speech talking about mental illness, and you know, no one will say anything in the Q&A about it for the most part, but I'll get like 5 or 6 people coming up to me afterwards. And then I'll get a bunch of emails where someone says, you know, my sister committed suicide, or this happened to me, or my son is living at home. And every family has that reality. And I think the way we tap into that from an advocacy standpoint and changing the system is to not pretend like it doesn't affect us. So like I even personalize it with talking about when I go to therapy and how much it helps me run for Congress, because man, this is a really bizarre experience to have your face everywhere. You know, so, I mean, I'm not trying to cop out on that answer, but I really do believe that we can change things. And the more likely people to do it are not people who've been there for 30 years, taking money from corporations, you know, working their way up their dues, putting their dues in so that they can become a committee chair. I don't ever want to be a committee chair if it means that I have to listen to everything Nancy Pelosi says. No, thank you. Like, deal me out. Okay. Yeah. I would just like to represent my community. I don't care if I'm the squeaky wheel. I didn't come to make friends. I came to make change. And I think we're going to hopefully see more people like that.
Yeah, I do think it's important. The one thing you brought up in terms of who is in the mental health caucus, just in New York in general, really speaks to, I think, a lot of the bipartisan nature of some of the issues that you're talking about. I think mental health is something that is clearly obvious. It should not be a polarizing topic. Frankly, mental health is one of the most common excuses used by the right when it comes to mass shootings. They don't point at guns. They constantly are saying we have a mental health crisis. Okay, well, we have a mental health crisis. Let's handle that then, because we don't disagree with you there. We may say we need additional regulation as well, but let's solve the mental health crisis. And similarly, technology is something that should not be a partisan issue either. So I think
Mm-mm.
you're right. It does take new blood who are not going to have these corporate-backed interests that are going to basically try to obstruct these issues. But it also
Yeah.
takes just saying, hey, I'll work with anyone on these issues. And if it's the only
Yes.
Republican in my state, so be it. Let's get everyone
Yes.
else on board. So,
Yes.
yeah, the next thing I wanted to ask you on that kind of political strategy side is, we have a lot of like progressives that, frankly, we have some question marks about what they want in like a coalition. For example, a lot of people had claimed that Elizabeth Warren represented a progressive branding, but she had even decided to endorse Jerry Nadler in your race. What in your mind is the forms of coalition that you want to have? What are the like quote unquote kind of litmus test factors that you have? And then, if you have any general reactions to Elizabeth Warren opining in your race as well.
Yeah, sure. So let me figure out how I want to handle that. Okay. So to me, the two biggest systemic issues we have is deep structural inequality and in our economy. Well, I'd say three. Deep structural inequality in our economy.
Yep.
And the way we deal with that is through transforming the healthcare system to a Medicare for all system, to thinking of housing as a human right. And that doesn't mean we all come to the table with the same kind of solutions for that, but knowing that housing is something that people should should expect to get, and deeply rethinking systemic racism and how we respond to that, ultimately through reparations and other forms of social policies. And then on the other hand, climate related, because we're not going to have a world in the next 20 to 30 to 50 years if we don't confront our climate disaster. Those are the two broad buckets for me that a lot fits within. You don't necessarily have to have the same approach to every problem, in my view. You can't take corporate PAC money. I think that just has to be gone. I'm not going to take it ever. I think increasingly we should be moving away from money in politics. I think we should be able to expect that of our leaders because it has a huge negative impact on the kinds of pieces of legislation and for whom Washington works. And I don't think we should be so committed to incumbency, because that is a huge issue that breeds a lot of the problems we have. I guess if I'm just spitballing aloud, it's kind of extreme inequality in all its forms, including systemic racism, and then climate-related disasters and how we deal with this issue. Those are the two big existential issues of our time, in my view. But then how we deal with it, or how we get ourselves out of it, also has to do with corporate and special interest groups influencing our elections, and this propensity to just try and keep people in power, because it does things like gerrymander districts to just make it so that Congressman Nadler gets to be reelected every 2 years. It makes people less interested in engaging in the political process, and it creates it reduces the chance that our politicians and our leaders will be more accurately representing the country in the future. So, it was more important to Nancy Pelosi and Sherry Bustos to prevent women like me from, being effective at running for office than it was for them to have a more diverse Congress. And that is not democratic, and it's not progressive. And, for me, candidly, I can have the personal reaction to thinking it's like total bullshit that Elizabeth Warren endorsed Jerry Nadler and she called him a winner, which is obviously she didn't write that because he's not a winner.
Who cares about that? Yeah, that's such a terrible message. Yeah.
What does that even mean? What did he win? He's passed 4 of his own pieces of legislation.
A winner for himself, not the people.
Yeah. So I have that personal reaction, but then, everything I do right now, it has to have a bigger meaning to me in order to put myself through this unbelievably bizarre, difficult experience that is the most difficult thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
And everything I do has to be measured against two things. Is this worth taking my time away from my kid? One. And am I going to have a bigger impact than just myself? Because if I'm not, then it's not worth it. It goes back to the first thing. And if I'm just helping myself get elected, then it really doesn't matter that much to me, because that does not have lasting power. What has lasting power is if I help change the system, especially for other women. And so when people see me getting all hot and bothered or getting pissed about something or expressing something that I find problematic, I'm pretty much always doing it because I think my doing it will change things for someone else. And I would prefer it if Elizabeth Warren or women who have a bully pulpit and a platform to support other women didn't just screw them over. Like, I would prefer that. And I would prefer it not just for myself, but I would prefer it for other women, especially as someone who was a supporter of her. But at the very least, if you're going to go through the process of making an endorsement as if it's supposed to carry weight, then it should probably carry enough weight that you took the time to at least know who the other candidate was. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that sufficiently answers it. It's a very comprehensive answer. So the last question that I have for you before we let people know if they've liked what you've said today, how to be able to help out, is, there's one other individual who is currently in your race currently, Jonathan Herzog. I wanted to know what your relationship with him is. And for those that are looking for a change, compared to Jerry Nadler, why do you think you're the better candidate to do that compared to him?
Sure. Well, I think I'm glad that people are running. I'm glad that the system is changing so that everyone thinks that they can. But I think how you run is also an expression of how effective you'll be in leading. I've raised almost $1 million. I have a full-time staff of 6 people. The leadership is entirely moms. Our campaign manager is a mom in the community who lives in the district. Our communications director is a mom in the district. Our team represents every kind of diversity from LGBT to beyond. And we've run and are running an incredibly aggressive campaign. I'm spending most of my hours every day talking to people in our community. And I think the only way you'll see that is when it's reflected in how people vote. And that's why I think I'm going to win. I have no problem with people running against the system because it would be really hypocritical of me to say otherwise, right? But just because everyone should do it doesn't mean that every kind of person is going to be effective. And I think I will have shown in the final analysis that our team has been highly effective at reaching people in our community with the end goal of actually serving them better. And that is all that matters. Okay. And that will speak for myself if I win. And I'm calling it now. I'm going to win.
Okay, well, we hope to see some result that results in Nadler coming out, whether it is yourself or Herzog. We would really appreciate seeing change in that district. So, Lindsey, for those that enjoyed hearing your perspective today and the issues you're campaigning on, how can they be able to help you out currently? We have your website, lindseyboylan.com, scrolling across the bottom of the page for anyone that's watching. How are you looking for people to be able to support you with, what's it now, a little bit more than a week to go?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. We're so close. So, people can sign up to volunteer on our website, and the link you see it, obviously. And we would love the support with phone banking, text banking. And then if folks are in New York, we could really use help with, in-person work, obviously socially distanced. But we are going to have early voting starting this weekend, and we need help with posters and setting up collateral and the like, to make sure people are reminded to get out there and vote. So if people go on our website, they can sign up to volunteer, and we will welcome any and all support. And if you like what we're doing, talk about it on social media, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. We would really appreciate that.
Okay. Well, Lindsey, thank you so much for coming on today and answering my questions. I really appreciate that. Rosebuds out there, thank you so much for tuning in to be able to listen to Lindsey. I really am looking forward to seeing these results in the coming days, because I think Lindsey's right. Nadler's going to lose. So I look forward to being able to support whoever is coming through the door. And I'm really appreciative that you took the time to be able to do this. The last thing I wanted to wrap up, folks, with is, I wanted to just make sure that everyone's aware. We have a big event upcoming this weekend on June 14th. We're having a 10-hour-long stream on one specific subject. That subject is, how do you make government work? How do you make it more representative, more trustworthy, and more efficient? So we're entitling this a 21st Century People-Powered Government, and we're going to be interviewing 19 candidates in total in 30-minute chunks, kind of like what we have done today here with Lindsey. So please tune into that. We're going to be starting at noon Eastern time to be able to kick off that stream. So we look forward to seeing you all on Sunday for that. Lindsey, thank you again for being here. And everyone, I hope you're staying safe out there. And as always, I hope you're staying rosy.